The 31st departure beacon logged at 0340 station time, and I noted it the way I had noted the 30 before it, calmly, in the column marked outbound, with the vessel designation and the timestamp and the registry seal of the Valdrec sovereignty. Then I set my stylus down and looked at the return column, which was blank and had been blank for 4 months, which I already understood was going to stay that way. I have kept the forbidden registers for 11 years. I say this not to establish my authority, but to explain my state of mind that morning. 11 years is long enough to stop being surprised by what the registers record. It is also long enough to understand the kind of certainty that sits in the body rather than the mind. What the blank return column means when it stays blank long enough. The registers themselves are old. Older than my posting, older than the registry office, older than the Sorvelian outer reach in its current administrative form. They are kept on the same vault-grade archival medium the designation authorities used when the forbidden line was first drawn, which tells you something about how seriously the original surveyors took the job. Each volume covers a 50-cycle window. Each entry follows the same format: the date, the incursion party, the vessel count, the stated purpose, the departure beacon sequence, 2 columns side by side of equal width. Outbound, returned. The returned column across all volumes, across the entire history of the registers, contains very few entries. Those that exist are annotated. Most of the annotations are short. Some are a single word. The word appears most often in the volumes covering the early incursion period, before the designation was widely understood, when various parties still believed the line was a navigational convention rather than a record of outcomes. After a certain point in the archive, a point I can put my finger on, literally, a specific volume and page, the returned column begins to thin. The incursions become less frequent, the entries become more spaced, the parties become smaller and less official: scouts, prospectors, 1 or 2 independent contractors who either did not know about the registers or did not believe them. The last significant incursion before the Valdrec sovereignty was logged 43 cycles prior. A mid-tier extraction consortium, 12 vessels, stated purpose commercial survey, outbound column, full, returned column blank. The annotation in the margin, written by my predecessor's predecessor: no distress signal, no debris field at border, no record of return. Designation confirmed active. That is the standard notation. I have written it myself twice in 11 years. Minor incursions. Single vessels both times. The kind of thing that happens when a captain either hasn't read the charts or has decided the charts are wrong. I logged the departures. I waited the standard confirmation window. I wrote the notation and sealed the entries. It is not pleasant work. It is necessary work. The registers exist precisely so that the notation is available to whoever comes next and asks whether the designation is still warranted. Valdrec's sovereignty did not read the registers before they crossed. Or they read them and reached a conclusion I have seen reached before, in the earlier volumes, by parties that no longer exist to revise their conclusions. The sovereignty was mid-tier by galactic standards. 3 home systems, 11 settled territories, a standing fleet of considerable size for their classification. They had been expanding along the outer reach for roughly 80 cycles, absorbing small polities through a combination of military pressure and economic strangulation that their own diplomatic communications referred to with a frankness I found almost admirable, as administrative integration. The forbidden designation covered a region they wanted. That was the substance of it. They wanted the transit corridor that ran through human space because it cut 40 cycles off the supply route to their eastern territories, and the long way around was becoming untenable as their expansion continued. I know this because the Sovereignty Preliminary Survey Team filed a formal inquiry with the Registry Office 14 months before the first vessel crossed. I handled the inquiry myself. I sent back the standard response: a copy of the designation authority's original filing, the updated confirmation notations, the contact protocol for parties wishing to negotiate passage directly with the human administration. The sovereignty did not pursue the contact protocol. They sent, instead, a secondary inquiry, whether the designation had been tested recently, and by whom, and requesting access to the returned column data for independent verification purposes. I sent them the column data, all of it, every volume. I thought when I did it that seeing the full record would settle the matter. Their third communication arrived 6 weeks later. It was addressed not to the registry office but to the Civilian Outer Reach Administrative Authority, and it characterized the forbidden designation as a legacy instrument of uncertain provenance maintained by a bureaucratic institution with no enforcement capability and the demonstrated history of accepting the disappearance of small, under-equipped incursion parties as confirmation of a threat that had never been formally documented, measured, or verified. The communication ran to 40 pages. It used the word worthless in reference to the register data 3 times, and the word superstition 7 times. It concluded with the sovereignty's formal notification of intent to exercise transit rights through what they termed the so-called forbidden corridor beginning in 90 days. I filed the communication in the registry archive, in the folder maintained for pre-incursion correspondence. The folder is thick. It contains documents going back to the original designation period, parties that used different words, but arrived at the same conclusion, that the registers were the product of insufficient data, institutional timidity, or deliberate navigational monopoly. Some of those documents are well-reasoned. A few are genuinely compelling. All of them are in the folder, rather than in ongoing correspondence, because the parties that authored them are no longer in a position to continue the exchange. The first sovereignty vessel crossed 93 days after the notification. I logged it at 0612 station time. It was a scout-class ship, light armament, crew of 14. The designation classification I entered in the registry was official governmental. Incursion Valdrec Sovereignty, Vessel 1 of projected fleet sequence. I entered the departure beacon frequency and the timestamp. I left the returned column blank and waited. The second vessel followed 11 days later. Then 2 more within the same week. The sovereignty was moving methodically, which I noted because it was unusual. Most parties that cross do so in a single committed action. The sovereignty was staging, sending vessels in sequence, presumably waiting for each one to reach a communication checkpoint before committing the next. It was, I thought, a reasonably intelligent approach for a party that had not yet understood what the absence of checkpoint communications would mean. By the end of the second month, 16 vessels had crossed. None had returned. None had transmitted from beyond the border. The sovereignty's relay stations along the outer reach, which I could monitor from the registry office's passive sensor suite, had gone from routine traffic to what I can only describe as a sustained pattern of increasingly formal silence. The kind of silence that institutional communications adopt when the institution does not yet want to acknowledge what the silence means. I logged each departure. I monitored the outbound column as it filled. I kept the returned column blank, because it was blank, because that is what the register requires. Accuracy, not comfort. The 23rd vessel crossed in the 3rd month. I remember this one particular because a junior registry assistant named Sorvith, who had been with the office for only 8 months and had not yet read the full archive, asked me whether we should send a warning signal into the corridor. She was not wrong to ask. The question had been raised before in earlier periods by earlier registry staff. The answer, which is in the procedural notes and which I explained to her as gently as I could, is that the designation exists because the warnings were sent in the early period, before the registers were formalized, and the warnings did not produce a different outcome. What they produced was additional entries in the outbound column. She did not ask again. She began reading the earlier volumes on her own time, which I considered the appropriate response. 31st vessel crossed at 034 on the I mentioned at the beginning of this account. I logged it. I set my stylus down. Sorvith was at her station across the chamber, and she looked at me, and I looked at the outbound column, which now contained 31 entries, and the returned column, which contained none, and I told her to begin preparing the confirmation notation. She asked how long we waited before writing it. I told her the standard confirmation window was 90 days from the last departure beacon. I told her that in my experience, the window was formality, that the outcome was established well before the window closed, that the purpose of the window was not hope, it was procedure, and procedure mattered because the register was a legal instrument, and legal instruments required their forms to be observed even when the forms felt unnecessary. She nodded and went back to her work. The 90-day window passed. No return beacon logged, no transmission from the corridor. The sovereignty's relay traffic, which I had continued to monitor, had moved through several identifiable stages. The formal silence. Then, a period of what appeared to be internal military communication on encrypted channels. Then a longer period of administrative communication that my passive sensors could not decrypt, but which had the cadence, in its volume and its routing patterns, of an institution trying to account for a very large absence. Then, in the final weeks of the window, something quieter. Fewer transmissions overall. A contraction of signal that I have seen before in the monitoring records for other parties, and which I have come to associate with the particular kind of institutional shock that sets in when the accounting is complete and the numbers do not balance and there is no further revision to attempt. On the 91st day, I wrote the notation: no distress signal, no debris field at border, no return hint from any of 31 vessels across a 4-month incursion sequence, no communication from corridor interior at any point following border crossing, designation confirmed active, registry sealed. I sealed the volume and filed it in the archive, in its sequence with the others, on the shelf where it will remain until the next party asks to see the returned column data, and I send them all of it, every volume, the way I sent it, to the Valdrek Sovereignty 14 months before their first vessel crossed. The sovereignty itself did not survive the loss intact. 31 vessels represent a significant fraction of their standing fleet. The fraction they had committed to the eastern expansion. The fraction they could not replace quickly enough to hold the territories they had already absorbed. I know from subsequent registry communications that several of those territories requested reclassification within 2 cycles of the fleet's disappearance. The sovereignty's home systems are still inhabited, but they do not have a fleet anymore, and they do not have eastern territories, and they do not, as far as the registry office can determine, have any current interest in the forbidden designation or the corridor that runs through it. The 40-page communication, the one with worthless 3 times and superstition 7, is still in the pre-incursion folder. I have not removed it. The folder is part of the archive, and the archive is the record, and the record exists for whoever comes next, and ask whether anyone has ever looked carefully at the register data and concluded it was insufficient. The answer is yes. The answer has always been yes. The folder is full of people who looked carefully and concluded it was insufficient. Their conclusions are in the folder. Their vessels are in the outbound column. The returned column is what it is. I have kept the forbidden registers for 11 years. In 11 years, I have learned that the designation does not require defense or explanation, enforcement. It requires only that someone sit in the registry chamber and maintain the columns accurately, cycle after cycle, and that the archive remain accessible to anyone who wishes to consult it before they decide what the blank spaces mean. Most do not consult it. Some consult it and decide the blank spaces mean something other than what they mean. Few consult it and decide the blank spaces mean exactly what they mean, and do not cross and go the long way around, and arrive where they were going. Those are the ones I do not log. They do not appear in the registers at all. The registers only record what enters the corridor. What enters the corridor does not come back. That is not a superstition. That is the outbound column and the returned column, side by side, of equal width, across every volume on that shelf. And I will be here when the next party asks to see them.